Good afternoon, and welcome to our weekly class in Pirkei Avot, Ethics of the Fathers, Chapter 6, and we're up to the third Mishnah, the third paragraph. The first two paragraphs, and as well as the entire chapter, to a great extent, revolves around the importance of Torah study. And within Torah study, it revolves around Torah study lishma, for its own sake. And Torah lishma, for its own sake, means, first and foremost, that you recognize, appreciate, and respect the divinity of Torah. The Torah is divine wisdom, not just some beautiful piece of literature, poetry, law, guidance, inspiration. Those are all great things, but they come second. The primary approach to Torah is that this is divine wisdom, and by studying Torah, I am absorbing divinity, godliness, into my brain, which means into my whole being. And continuing on that theme, the third Mishnah says something pretty radical. One who learns from his fellow one chapter, one halacha, that's a law, one verse, or one word, or even one letter of Torah we're talking about. Someone just teaches you one chapter, one law, one verse, one word, even one letter, is obligated to treat him with honor, with respect. What is this based on? For so we find with David, king of Israel, who learned from Ahitophel. I'll soon tell you who he was. No more than two things, yet called him his master, his guide, and his beloved friend. And he quotes a verse in the book of Psalms, as it is said, but it was you, a man mine equal, my guide, and my beloved friend. Is this not an argument we could deduce from less to the greater? In Hebrew, the idea of kal v'chomer is when we deduce things from a minor to a major. It's like if, let's say, a person, I'll give you an example, a simple illustration. If someone is told that if you steal something worth $100, you get a year in jail, how much more so if you stole $1,000, that you should get that year in jail, maybe even more, but at least that year in jail. So you're deducing a major from a minor. And here also we're deducing a major from a minor. That means a major situation from a minor situation. Why is it minor over here? If David, king of Israel, who learned from Ahitophel no more than two things, nevertheless called him his master, his guide, and his beloved friend, then in the case of one who learns from his fellow one chapter or one halacha or one verse or one word or even one letter, all the more so he is under obligation to treat him with honor. What is the argument over here? You're talking about the king. There's no one in Jewish law that requires our giving him a respect or an honor than a king. And you're talking about King David. Of all the kings, no one could compare to King David. He was the holiest and greatest of all the kings. In spite of what secular people will always refer to one incident in his life, the story of King David and Bathsheba, which is a subject unto itself. But King David is referred to in biblical literature as being God's servant, and that his love for Torah was unparalleled. If you look in the book of Psalms, the longest psalm and the longest chapter in all of the Bible is Psalm 119, where it has 176 verses extolling the greatness of Torah and his love for Torah, his passion for Torah. He was crazy for Torah. That was what defines King David. King David is associated with the highest levels of Torah study, with the highest levels of prayer, The Psalms is most of our prayers are based on the book of Psalms, and he's the king of Israel. He has every aspect of greatness, and yet he, who learned only two things from this man Ahitophel, and I'll soon tell you who this man Ahitophel was, that if he treated him with such respect, that he called him his master, his guide, and his beloved friend, even though he only learned two things, then in the case who learns from his fellow one chapter, or one halacha, one verse, one word, or even one letter, all the more so he is under obligation to treat him with respect, honor, respect. Now, there's an obvious question over here. He learned two things from Ahitophel. How could we deduce from that even if you learn one thing? So I'll get to that in a moment. But first let me tell you a little bit of Ahitophel. Very colorful character. He's considered to be one of the most evil people that ever lived. And yet, he was one of the most important authorities of Jewish law. We already had occasion to meet Acher, the renegade rabbi, who was a great scholar and turned against Judaism. Well, he was in the tradition of Ahitophel. Ahitophel was the head of the Sanhedrin. That means he was the most brilliant Torah scholar in the land of Israel. He was the top of his field. And he was the greatest advisor that King David used. Whenever King David would have to wage war, who did he consult with? Ahitophel. So he wasn't just brilliant in Jewish law, he was brilliant in military strategy. He knew exactly what to do and how to wage war. He had every quality you can think of. He was such a prestigious person, and yet he's one of the few people, it says in the Talmud, the Mishnah, that he does not have a share in the world to come because he was so evil. What did he do that was so evil? He was King David's personal advisor. He was the head of the Sanhedrin. But King David had a son whose name was Absalom. And Absalom started a rebellion against his father. And who pushed Absalom to do this rebellion and who advised him? Ahitophel. Why did Ahitophel support Absalom against King David? The end was Absalom was killed in that battle and King David was restored. But for 6 months, King David was not king. He was fleeing his own son. Who was the one who supported Absalom? Ahitophel. Why? Because he wanted to be king. And he knew that he couldn't fight against King David, so he gets King David's son, knowing that in the end, King David's son will probably be killed, and he would take over, he would become the king. So he was power hungry. It wasn't enough that he was the head of the Sanhedrin, he felt he had to be also the king.
How did he get to be the head of the Sanhedrin?
He was the greatest scholar. And he was a young man. He died at the age of 33, I think. What? He committed suicide at the end. When he realized, when the rebellion was quashed, he knew that he would be executed for treason, for supporting a rebellion against the king. That was punishable by death. So he took his own life. But he seemed to be a great person. What was lacking in him is that everything he did was not sincere. His attachment to Torah was insincere. He used Torah as a stepping stone to get to power. The Sanhedrin was the ruling body of Judaism. It's like the Supreme Court, but it's much more than the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has the most power in this country. They can overturn a law that was passed by the Congress and the President. So in a certain sense, the courts have greater power than the President and the Congress. But it's still only an equal branch of government. The Sanhedrin was not equal. Sanhedrin was more powerful than the king and more powerful than any other members of the leadership of Israel, because the Sanhedrin was not just a judiciary, they were also a legislative body. So they had like two hats, judicial and legislative. And they could override anything the king would do and the king would say, because the king was bound by the laws of the Torah. And who were the ones entrusted with ruling in accordance with Torah? It was the Sanhedrin. They would take a vote on anything, and their vote prevailed. They had more power really than, they didn't have an army at their disposal, but they did have more power. And here Ahitophel got this power, but he wasn't content. He wanted more. We find a parallel to that later on in history when the Maccabees took over, known also as the Hasmoneans, Hashmonaim. They became the leaders. And that was a big mistake on their part because they were Kohanim, they were priests. And they had members of the family were the high priests. Why do you need to have more power? That's what happens to people who are in power. They're not content with the power they have, no matter how much power they have. They want more than that. And you see that throughout history and even today, where people are not content with having some degree of power. They want to have all the power. So Ahitophel was a power-hungry person, and his commitment to Torah was misafa ulachutz, was from the lips and beyond the lips. In other words, it was external. It was superficial. It was insincere. But yet, King David learned two things from him. What are the two things that he learned from him? So the commentaries cite the verse in Psalms and the commentary on that verse. King David was once studying Torah by himself. And Ahitophel sees him and he says, "Why are you learning Torah by yourself? Anytime you learn something by yourself, you become foolish. Because all your misinterpretations and all your mistakes become ingrained in you. You have no one to correct you, no one to challenge you, no one to show you that you're giving the wrong interpretation." So he advised King David to learn with him as a partner. That was one thing. Another thing that he saw King David was walking into the house of study, standing upright with exhibiting pride. And Ahitophel told him, no, that's not the way you come into the house of God. In the house of God, you have to come in with humility. Now, it's interesting. The man who was the very antithesis of humility was recommending King David have humility. So, what is the how does that expression go? That the best trait you could have is sincerity, and if you could fake it, you're really doing well. He faked humility by teaching King David to have humility. King David was one of the most humble people on the face of the earth. There were three humble models in the Torah: Abraham, Moses, and King David. Abraham says, "I'm just earth and ashes, dust and ashes." Moses says, "We're nothing. Who are we? We're nothing." And King David says, "I'm like a worm, not a person. I have no value as a human being. I'm just like a worm." So King David is known for his humility, but this Ahitophel had to show him, "I'm going to teach you what humility is." Another interpretation is that he saw King David was walking into the house of study and didn't show enough passion. So we said you have to show passion when you learn Torah. And the word that's used in the book of Psalms is beregesh. You have to come with emotion. And one commentary says the word beregesh, with emotion, is an acronym. Barad, hail; ruach, wind; geshamim, rain; and sheleg, snow. Describing buffalo.
In one day.
Right, so we have to, when you enter into the house of God, you have to be prepared to weather all the storms and just don't care, rain or shine. What do they say about post office workers? They'll go rain or shine. Well, that's how you have to go with Torah, and with a smile on your face when you come in a snowstorm into the shul to daven and to learn Torah. So either way, he was giving King David advice as to how you approach Torah. He was the ultimate hypocrite because he was the very antithesis of all that, but he advised King David. So even though he was insincere with his teaching, he was not a model of the very teachings that he used for King David. And yet King David treated him with respect. Those are the two things. Now, the question is asked that there's a third thing that he taught King David. It's mentioned in the Talmud. when King David, what was King David's greatest wish? What did he want more than anything else? He wanted to build the Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple. Now, the Holy Temple existed in King David's time. The temple was in a place that it didn't allow it to be the full temple. It was not the full structure. It was the Mishkan, like the tabernacle, where in the city called Nov. And then later on it moved to a place called Givon. So in King David's time, there was a temple, not the complete temple, didn't have the ark in it. But King David wanted to build a permanent structure for God in Jerusalem. And God did not allow him to do it. Why? Because King David was involved in so many wars. He spilled blood, and God did not want the temple to be built by a person who was involved in wars. He wanted it to be built by King Solomon, in whose time there would be peace. Now, it doesn't mean that King David did anything wrong by fighting those wars. Those were all necessary wars. But war is not the end. And that's the contemporary lesson. As much as Israel is involved in fighting, and they should continue fighting this war till they succeed and have full victory, but that's not what Jews want to be involved in perpetually. We want to get over the wars. And the tragedy is, and I'm going a little bit off the subject, but the tragedy in Israel is that if they stop fighting now, guaranteed within another 2 years or less, or maybe more, there'll be another war like this, and another war, and another war. The people, the peaceniks who are saying they want ceasefire, are actually calling for many more wars and terrorist actions in between. The only way you could stop war is by winning the war conclusively, just like we won World War II. We didn't compromise with Japan and Germany. That's why we have peace with them, and they're our allies. You have to win the war to stop wars. So King David was involved in just wars, but God says, I want someone who symbolizes total peace, because that's the goal of the temple, to bring total peace in the world. But King David, nevertheless, that was his greatest passion. He did whatever he can do to prepare for the building of the temple. So, for example, he raised funds. He was a great fundraiser. He raised all the funds that would be necessary to build the temple. Number two, he also dug channels underneath the temple, because when they poured wine on the altar, the wine would go down into these channels. And on this occasion, when he was digging underground tunnels and channels, yes, we had tunnels in the past. We were first with tunnels. What he did was he exposed an underground fountain of water, and the water was coming out and threatening to destroy the world. Does it mean literally the whole world, or it means threatening to destroy the whole area? Whatever it is. And he had only one way to plug that hole: to write God's name on a piece of pottery and to put it on top of the opening, and that would miraculously cause the water to subside. But he had a problem, because the piece of pottery would have God's name on it. One of the negative commandments in the Torah, one of the 613 commandments, is we're not allowed to destroy something holy. And putting that on the water would entail destroying, erasing God's name. Was he allowed to do that or not? By the way, it has contemporary application. The question was asked, this goes back about 100 years, that people were taken to hospitals with contagious diseases. And the question was, could they bring their tefillin to the hospital? Because the way the hospitals work, I don't know if it's still true today, anything you brought in that you put on your body because of the contagious diseases would be destroyed, would be burnt. So if you brought your tefillin into the hospital to put on tefillin, because they would have to destroy it, would you be allowed to bring the tefillin into the hospital because you're causing the tefillin to be destroyed? I'm not going to give an answer to that question, because there were different opinions about it, but that's the contemporary application. So King David wanted to know, could we do it? And Ahitophel says, yes, you can do it. And he based it on the fact when a woman was suspected of adultery in the biblical times, she would be brought to the temple and she would be given a potion that was made from ink. They would write a section of the Torah on a piece of parchment with ink that could be erased, and then they would erase the ink into water, and she would then drink that water. It was harmless water, but if she was guilty, it would kill her. If she was innocent, nothing would happen because the water was harmless. And what would they do? They would write down a section of the Torah that had God's name on it. Are you allowed to erase God's name? Well, the Torah says you should do it. Why? Because God said, I'm willing that you erase my name if this is going to bring peace between husband and wife. It's worthy to erase my name, God says, if this could bring peace. So if you're allowed to erase God's name to bring peace between husband and wife, just two people, how much more so if this is going to save who knows how many countless lives if the flood expands and does not subside. And he told David that he can put that piece of pottery, which he did, and the world was saved from that catastrophe. So why isn't that counted as a third thing? So one of the answers given is that he called Ahitophel his teacher and all the other titles of honor before that event happened. So you don't need three things, only two things are enough for you to justify giving that person the honor, the dignity, because of what they taught you. But then the question still remains, Ahitophel taught King David two things. Why are we saying that even if you teach one thing, you have to give that person honor and respect? So one answer given is, he didn't teach King David any laws. He taught him etiquette. That when you enter into the house of study, that when you study Torah, you should study with a partner. There's no law that requires you to study with a partner. It's just good advice. If you want to retain your knowledge, if you want to make sure that your knowledge is not distorted, it's good to have someone to challenge you. But you don't have an obligation. There's no law that says if you learn Torah by yourself, you're committing a sin. So he really didn't teach him anything that was considered to be legal. When he told him you should bend your head when you walk into the house of study to show a little humility, there's no law that requires that. That's just what we call derech eretz. It's proper comportment. It's good advice. So even though he didn't really teach him anything that's really mandatory, a real part of Torah law, and still he gave him honor, certainly when you teach someone a part of Torah itself. The Baal Shem Tov gave a different explanation. When you learn any part of Torah, and you learn with the right intention, any one thing that you learn proliferates. Any one thing that you learn doesn't remain one thing. Just like when it comes to literal procreation, you give birth to one child. That one child is going to have a child, and that grandchild will have a child, and it goes on forever. There's no such thing as reproduction that ends. Of course, there are people who can't have children, but reproduction in general continues from one generation to another. The Talmud says the same thing is true with Torah. When you study Torah, you're studying one bit of information. That bit of information will give birth to another information, more information. But that's only true if your approach to Torah is the right approach. If you invite God into your Torah study. Just like when it comes to reproduction, the Talmud says a human being has three partners in his creation: the father, the mother, and God. If you leave God out of the reproductive process, you won't have children. If you leave out the father or the mother, you can't have a child. But by the same token, if you leave out God, it's not going to happen. The same thing is true with Torah study. When you study Torah, and your Torah study does not have God's involvement. In other words, you're learning Torah simply as a subject, like any other subject, especially if you're learning Torah just for your own self-aggrandizement, for your own honor and pursuit of power and influence, which is what Ahitophel did. His Torah remained two things. It didn't grow. It didn't reproduce. It didn't have any impact. It had zero impact. So anytime a Jew studies Torah with the right approach, the right intention, it'll proliferate. It's exponential. Your Torah study doesn't just remain with that one teaching. Achitophel's Torah study didn't impact the world at all. It didn't proliferate. And in spite of that, King David gave him respect and honor. The question that commentaries, I didn't see them address, why did he give him honor? If his Torah was really not valid, his Torah study was devoid of any real spirituality, it was just like any other subject, so why did he give him honor if it didn't have any real substance to it? What was King David's rationale for giving him honor? We find a similar thing with Rabbi Meir, that I mentioned in the other class, that Rabbi Meir, even after his teacher rebelled against Judaism and was another Ahitophel figure, obviously his Torah study was not sincere, why did he still treat him with respect? That was a question. Does anyone think of an answer?
He was teaching somebody.
What?
He was teaching somebody.
Right, he was teaching Rabbi Meir, and Rabbi Meir treated him with respect. King David treated Ahitophel with respect, even though their Torah study was sterile. It was like a mule. It didn't have the ability to reproduce. It didn't have any positive impact on the world.
Did he realize that at the time?
Which one?
Did King David realize it at the time?
At the time, but he was not getting anywhere. We mentioned his Torah study.
If King David had realized it at the time, he wouldn't have continued to study with him and to treat him with respect and let him stay as the head of the Sanhedrin, and he wouldn't have trusted him with the rebellion of Absalom. He thought he was on his side. So it could be that he didn't know, but Rabbi Meir certainly knew that Acher, his teacher, was a rebel against Judaism. He certainly knew that because he did it openly. He would study under him even when he was violating the Shabbos. His teacher Acher was riding his horse on Shabbos, and Rabbi Meir was following him to hear his pearls of wisdom. Why would Rabbi Meir do that if the Torah study that he was engaged in was sterile? So the answer most likely is that even when Torah study is in the hands of the wrong person, it's still Torah. The Talmud talks about how a person could be impure, ritually impure, and he could still study Torah, because Torah is compared to fire. Fire can't become contaminated. You can't contaminate fire. And just like fire cannot be contaminated, Torah cannot be contaminated. So if someone studies Torah the wrong way, the defect is not in the Torah itself. The Torah remains Torah. The defect is in its ability to have an effect on the person. The person is resistant to it. So you could have a powerful medicine, but it won't help you, won't cure you, because you have a certain type of medical resistance to it. It doesn't. I know there are people who can get Novocaine, and it doesn't take away their pain. It doesn't do the job. The problem is not the Novocaine. The problem is not the drug. The problem is in the person who's resistant to the drug. Same thing is true here. The Torah itself cannot be contaminated. You can't say this Torah is bad Torah. If it's Torah, it's good, but you can still be resistant to its effects.
But the teacher is teaching him the student interpretations of the Torah, with the meaning of the Torah. So, isn't that where the danger lies?
Okay, it could be. If you're not Rabbi Meir, then the Talmud says you shouldn't be studying Torah from a wicked person, because you might get the wrong ideas as well. He might be teaching you a distorted, a perverted Torah. But Rabbi Meir, the Talmud says, was able to eat a fruit and spit out the pit. He knew what to pick and what to reject. That's why normally you shouldn't look for a teacher who is, even though the brilliant scholar and knows a lot more than you, but you don't know what you're going to get from that person. But when he does teach Torah that's accurate, even though he is not affected by it, it doesn't make a difference. Nevertheless, it's still Torah, and if you're able to sort out the differences between the real Torah and the fake Torah, you can do it, which is limited to certain people like Rabbi Meir. Now, when he gives examples of one chapter. What he means by one chapter is, even if it's just an overview, you're not getting the details, you're not getting any depth, you're getting an overview. So you'd say, well, that's no big deal. Or even if you get not just an overview, but you focus on one halacha, on one law, or one verse in the written Torah, one halacha in the oral Torah. So one verse, you're already getting into the specifics. But even if it's more than that, it's one word. You're focused on one word. You can see deeper meaning in one word, because when it comes to Torah, every word has multiple layers of meaning. Unlike in English, you have a different word for every different nuance. Hebrew is the opposite. I don't think it's a language like English. English, there's no such thing as a real synonym in English. If you look in the dictionary, they'll give you synonyms. They'll tell you in some dictionaries the differences between one synonym and another. So there's a word for every synonym. In Hebrew, it's the opposite. One word can have a dozen different nuances. That's why no translation is adequate. So when you focus down on a word, you're able to get multiple meanings. That's a much greater transmission of knowledge. Or even one letter. There are so many cases in the Talmud where the Talmud takes one letter of the Torah, of the written Torah, and shows how that one letter could teach us laws that we wouldn't have known without that one letter. Every letter has, and I mentioned this last week, Moses was given a vision of the future of Rabbi Akiva, that Rabbi Akiva was able to interpret every little crown in every letter, not just every letter, but every crown in every letter. But most people couldn't do that. Only Rabbi Akiva could do that. No one else was able to do that. But every letter, that's something that people can do. So even if you teach someone the depth of one letter, even so, and Ahitophel did that, yet, and he still respected him. So it gives you all these different levels of knowledge, from an overview to more specific to more depth to even one letter. So that you certainly, if that's what you learn from a person, you certainly have to treat him with respect. Then it says there's no respect but Torah. What does he mean, no respect but Torah? So one interpretation commentaries give is that, what about if someone teaches you a secular subject, teaches you medicine, teaches you astronomy, teaches you mathematics? That doesn't apply there. You don't have to treat them with extra honor. Now, what does that mean? You have to treat every person with honor and dignity. That's a basic teaching, especially if it's someone who's your friend, your colleague, your teachers, even your students. You have to treat everyone with respect. We're talking about giving them inordinate respect, more respect than you would normally give another human being who you treat with dignity and respect. That's why King David, even though he learned only two things, calls him his master, calls him his guide, and his beloved friend. He's exaggerating the honor, So that only applies to Torah. Why? Because the honor is not to the person. The honor is to the divine aspect of Torah. So even though the person himself denies the divine aspect, he doesn't care about it, but the Torah itself is divine. So that demands of you to treat him with respect because of that divine element that's inherent in Torah. Any questions? Yes?
Did you say that King David had the authority to remove Ahitophel as head of the Sanhedrin?
Did he? I didn't say. Yeah, he could have had him removed if it would have been determined that he was not faithful to Torah.
So that was within the realm of the king and not within
No, the king
Sanhedrin
cannot
itself?
unilaterally remove someone from the Sanhedrin, but his power to influence the Sanhedrin, a king has that power. And King David was not just a king; he was also a great scholar in his own right. In fact, the Talmud says that when King Saul, King David's predecessor and father-in-law, was asked about King David, and they said all these great things about him as a warrior and everything, he wasn't impressed. When he said he's a great scholar, he still wasn't impressed. When they said, whenever King David argues about matters of law, the law always favors King David. He would always win the argument. That means God was always with him because the halacha follows him. That he said, I can't compete with. So King David in his own right was not just some autocratic leader who can just impose his will on people. He had the ability to convince people that this man was not worthy of being the head of the Sanhedrin. And if the head of the Sanhedrin would have treated King David with disrespect, he could have had him executed. That's the power that a king has that a head of a Sanhedrin does not have. So we have to treat people with respect, and the Torah has to be respected with even more.